Good morning, and welcome to Daily 15. Today's Daily 15 is titled Freud on Transience, and it comes from a short but important paper published just after World War I, in which Freud reflects on the nature of transience and explores whether the fact that things will end, the fact that things will die, impacts how beautiful they are now. If you'd like to read the text and annotations yourself, which we really encourage, you can navigate to alifeofthought.com/D15 to read the most recent Daily 15. If you're listening to this out of order, you can just scroll down, navigate to the bookshelf, and find Freud on Transience. Remember, what I say here is not supposed to be the last word, it's supposed to be the first one. Join the conversation, share your thoughts. If you disagree about an interpretation or whether or not Freud is right or wrong, head on over to community.alifeofthought.com, make a free account, and discuss the Daily 15 today. With all that out of the way, we'll get started with paragraph 1. Freud begins. On the contrary, an increase. Transience value is scarcity value in time. Limitation in the possibility of an enjoyment raises the value of the enjoyment. It was incomprehensible, I declared, that the thought of the transience of beauty should interfere with our joy in it. As regards the beauty of nature, each time it is destroyed by winter, it comes again next year, so that in relation to the length of our lives, it can in fact be regarded as eternal. The beauty of the human form and face vanish forever in the course of our own lives, but their evanescence only lends them a fresh charm. A flower that blossoms only for a single night does not seem to us on that account any less lovely. Nor can I understand any better why the beauty and perfection of a work of art or of an intellectual achievement should lose its worth because of its temporal limitation. A time may indeed come when the pictures and statues which we admire today will crumble to dust. Or a race of men may follow us who no longer understand the works of our poets and thinkers, or a geological epoch may even arrive when all animate life upon the earth ceases, but since the value of all this beauty and perfection is determined only by its significance for our own emotional lives, it has no need to survive us and is therefore independent of absolute duration. These considerations appeared to me incontestable, but I noticed that I had made no impression either upon the poet or upon my friend. My failure led me to infer that some powerful emotional factor was at work, which was disturbing their judgment, and I believed later that I had discovered what it was. What spoiled their enjoyment of beauty must have been a revolt in their minds against mourning. The idea that all this beauty was transient was giving these two sensitive minds a foretaste of mourning over its decease, and since the mind instinctively recoils from anything that is painful, they felt their enjoyment of beauty interfered with by thoughts of its transience. Now, I think what Freud is talking about here should feel relevant. It should feel personal because, speaking for myself at least, this is a common thing to experience. Now, in light of this, I want to start by giving some context, and that brings us to our highlighted phrase. Freud begins, on the contrary, an increase. Transience value is scarcity value in time. Now, it's important to understand that the paragraph and just this whole essay that we're working with comes in response to a conversation Freud has with a poet friend of his, who, while seeing and experiencing beauty in nature, begins to think that eventually, all of this is going to die one day. The beauty and the trees and the flowers and the birds are all going to shrivel up, and thus, all that he would otherwise have loved and admired seemed to him, this is what it seems like to the poet, to be shorn of its worth by the transience which was its doom. That's a quote from Freud. Now, the thought, again, in plain English maybe, is that, okay, things are going to die. I recognize this. And somehow, for the poet, that takes away from them being beautiful now. It prevents him from appreciating them now. And so one experiencing something like this walks through nature and the world or an art museum or wherever they're experiencing beauty with a sort of numbness. Now, though the poet, they're a poet. He's being a bit dramatic. This is not an uncommon way of thinking. It's, in fact, I think perfectly reasonable and understandable if, for instance, one has just experienced a loss, for them to bang their fist on the table and they sort of ask something like about the relationship. They ask, what good was all of this if it was going to come to an end anyway? Like, why did we bother? And in the same way, if all plant life and all of paintings will one day, turn to dust, why bother appreciating them now? That's the question that we have to deal with. Now, Freud's initial response is to disagree, to say that someone who's moved by these concerns is simply confused, and he engages with the poet by trying to reason with him. He says, no, poet, scarcity actually makes things more valuable, right? This is how scarcity works. Just ask an economics professor. And in fact, that things must end is part of what makes them beautiful. And in some cases, we might think that it is only because things end and die that they're able to have value at all. It's not uncommon for people to turn down hypothetical offers of immortality, right? You ask a friend, would you want to live forever? They might turn it down because they feel that if life had no end, there would be no point to living it, no point in doing anything. And so there's a sense in which endings and death and turning to dust is necessary. I mean, Freud's quote about the flower is striking. I'll remind you of it. A flower that blossoms only for a single night does not seem to us on that account any less lovely. And in fact, if the flower lived forever, maybe it would be a little less beautiful if it never wilted. And this brings us to our underlined phrase. Freud says, these considerations appeared to me incontestable, but I noticed that I had made no impression either upon the poet or upon my friend. So what's happening here? Now, as powerful as these arguments seem to be, and they're good arguments, Freud notices something interesting. They feel powerful to us, but we are also people who are not gripped, like the poet, by the fact that everything is going to end. We are making these arguments sort of from a position of privilege in that we're not going through it like he is. We're not walking through parks or on the beach or through nature and constantly thinking, oh, yeah, this is going to die one day. This will all be dust. And so it'll help to empathize a bit. Imagine your friend is undergoing an existential crisis. He's depressed that everything is going to end, and you remind him that, for instance, a butterfly that lives forever is not really a butterfly at all. That's a quote from Lieutenant Commander Data of Star Trek. If he is genuinely in the midst of an existential crisis, this quote, sort of like Freud's arguments, is not going to mean a thing to him. It will feel like a mere platitude. And this is because he does not need to be reminded that some things are beautiful, which will also end. That's like misplacing the problem. He needs to be convinced in the first place that an ending does not take away from a thing's beauty. And if we simply start listing off things that we think are beautiful but in fact end, we're begging the question. We're taking it for granted, the very thing that he's unsure about, the very thing he's having a crisis about. So appeals to butterflies and flowers are no longer helpful, as part of what it is to undergo this type of crisis, and part of what defines it as a crisis in the first place, this is why it's so bad, is that even these things, even the most basic, beautiful things, seem to lose their glimmer. And it is at precisely this point that a Freudian strategy might prove useful. Freud's thought is that as strong as these arguments are, that they do not have an effect on himself or on his poet or on his friend means something. Specifically, it means that neither he nor his friend nor the poet are truly aware of the cause of their existential crisis. The transience, the feeling of transience about the flowers or the trees is a sort of screen. It's a misdirection. Of course, in one sense, this is ridiculous. They attribute it to transience. That's what they say, to the fact that all things die. That's what they're talking about. But the Freudian point is that if that were really the cause, if, I'm not seeing beauty because I'm recognizing that this tree is going to die, then the arguments would be successful. If their concern was about transience, then an argument which showed transience to be irrelevant to beauty would get rid of their anxiety. But it does not. It is entirely ineffective, and Freud takes this to imply that their concern is not about transience. And that brings me to our circled phrase, it's. Of course, there's a little bit more to the quote than that, but I really want to focus on that pronoun. But for context, I'll give you the rest of the quote. He says the idea that all this beauty was transient was giving these two sensitive minds a foretaste of mourning over its deceased. Now, I focused on that specific pronoun for a specific reason. Freud's point seems to be that the poet is so distressed, not because of the transience itself, but because the transience reminds him that things will end, and it gives him what Freud calls a foretaste of mourning. It brings on premature mourning. So first, the poet notices how pretty things are, and then he notices that they are transient, and this gives him a little bit of mourning. He begins to imagine the pain of losing these things one day. And it is here where transience begins to take away from the beauty. It takes away not because it brings on mourning, but because we seek to avoid the pain of mourning. And how do we do that? How do we avoid the pain of mourning? Well, simple. We turn away from the beauty that there is to mourn. We imagine that it is not there, that it was never there. Because we have nothing gained, because there is no beauty, we have nothing to lose, there is nothing lost, and thus there is nothing to mourn. And so because transience inspires mourning, and in an attempt to avoid mourning, we avert our eyes from the beauty of the world, we attribute this loss in an experience of beauty, we attribute our loss of beauty to the transience. Now, this is all fine and good, but it seems to me, to give a little personal commentary, like an incomplete explanation. The fact is, Freud's focus remains entirely on the beautiful objects themselves. He never asks why we became so preoccupied with their transience in the first place. Why is it that when I'm walking through a field or I see a beautiful flower, I begin thinking about how it's going to die? And why is it that that thought is able to give me a foretaste of mourning? Why am I not simply able to push it away? It seems to me that an obvious answer worth considering, at least worth considering as a possible interpretation, is that the concern that the poet has, that the friend has, is not about the transience of beautiful things themselves. That is just a screen. That's how it comes to the surface. That's how it's expressed. Rather, we might understand their problem as one of coming to terms with the transience of their own lives, and whether they're able to deal with the fact that one day they are going to die. And how does that interact and take away from whether or not their lives have meaning? And if this is right, it suddenly makes much more sense why we would worry about the beauty of flowers and of nature in such a state. Namely, the thought goes, if we are going to die and if our lives have no meaning in light of that, what point is there in appreciating the beauty of nature and flowers? Everything becomes numb. Now, my feeling, and again, this is my personal commentary that you need not agree with. If you disagree with it, you can go to community.alifeofthought.com and make your thoughts heard. My feeling is that unless this more existential concern is dealt with, the poet will continue to worry and to doubt. That's it for our annotations. We'll close with paragraph 2, the following paragraph. If you'd like to mark it up for yourself, you can head on over to alifeofthought.com/D15. Freud says, mourning over the loss of something that we have loved or admired seems so natural to the layman that he regards it as self-evident. But to psychologists, mourning is a great riddle, one of those phenomena which cannot themselves be explained, but to which other obscurities can be traced back. We possess, as it seems, a certain amount of capacity for love, what we call libido, which in the earliest stages of development is directed towards our own ego. Later, though still a very early time, this libido is diverted from the ego onto objects, which are thus, in a sense, taken into our ego. If the objects are destroyed or if they are lost to us, our capacity for love, our libido, is once more liberated, and it can then either take other objects instead or can temporarily return to the ego. But why it is that this detachment of libido from its objects should be such a painful process is a mystery to us, and we have not hitherto been able to frame any hypothesis to account for it. We only see that libido clings to its objects and will not renounce those that are lost even when a substitute lies ready to hand. Such, then, is mourning. If only we had another 15 minutes. That's all for Freud and Transience today. If you'd like to read and annotate it yourself, you can head on over to alifeofthought.com/D15. And if you'd like to join the conversation, you can head on over to community.alifeofthought.com. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.